Well, tēnā koutou, everyone. Thank you for coming and giving up your Sunday afternoons to listen to Laurence and I. I'll just tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm, as Laurence said, Don Christie. I'm an immigrant to New Zealand. I've been here for 20 years. I happened to arrive on a boat whose Swahili name was Mawingo, which means little cloud. And so I came to the land of the long white cloud in Little Cloud, which I quite liked. And I was born just a bit north of the Zambezi, and I've adopted a local mountain, even if that hasn't adopted me. That's Laurence's slide. So I assumed that I had an audience today that at least was interested in things digital. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the stuff that drives the people that work at my company, Catalyst, and how that relates perhaps to digital literacy and perhaps to opportunities that the sort of opportunities Laurence was talking about. To start with, I'll just tell you a little story about a project that we're doing right now for an oil-rich Middle Eastern country. We are rolling out an education system, a learning management system called Moodle. And this week it will move from servicing a few 100,000 students to 1.2 million students. And in a few months' time, we expect actually that there'll be about 4 million students online. In this particular country, when we say, oh yes, we're going to start, and the number of students will be, let's say, 40,000 students as the first prototype. What we've discovered is that on day one, 40,000 students log on and start using that system. That's pretty scary. And when they say there will be 1.2 million students, there actually are 1.2 million students. This story, though, is interesting because it's really, you know, Catalyst, Laurence said some very nice things about us, but we're still a tiny company, really. And we're using open source software as the system that is being used here. And we're doing it really for a pittance in global terms. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than millions of dollars. And this is the sort of thing that people in government, the enterprise architects, that traditional technologists tell you shouldn't be done. But what I want to talk to you about is how the approach that we're taking and that we've taken for our sort of technical lives should, I think, be used much more widely, and certainly much more widely in New Zealand. And my message, if there's one message I hope that people will be able to take away from this session and from the billions that are watching on the internet, is that if you can free your technology, then you can release an awful lot of potential. And what I'll show you, what I hope to show you, is how to free that technology. So, to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about something called free and open source software. And there's a few people in this room, and I'll be telling a few people how to suck eggs. But can I just, does anyone know what I mean when I'm talking about free and open source software? Yeah, there's probably about half the room. So basically, free and open source software is a way of collaborating and sharing on the building of software. And it's underpinned by certain rights that the software that we produce and that we share and that we use that are released to the users of that software, and those rights are formulated in a license, what would be called an open source or free software license. And those rights are that any code that forms the software that you're using should be free for anyone to look at, that you can make your own fixes and changes to suit yourself, and that you can share those changes and fixes with other people. And so we like to refer to it as a sort of like a good old community barn raising, where you're building something for the common good that will benefit society and benefit users of the technology that use it. I don't know why I keep getting that slide, Laurence. It's your fault. And does anyone know who these two people are? This is a trick question. So the young man over there, that's Bill Gates. And the chap sitting with the sideburns there, that's Paul Allen. They're the two founders of Microsoft. And in his recent autobiography, Paul Allen essentially admitted to using the open source way to when they were building their first tools that made the company Microsoft. And in this case, it was a basic compiler. And he said, "We borrowed bits and pieces of our design from previous versions, a long-standing software tradition. Languages evolve, ideas blend together. In computer technology, we all stand on each other's shoulders." And that's true. If you look at anything that you use in computing today, there's layers and layers of software that people have written and that have borrowed from each other. There's no one program drives your computer or your connection to the internet and so on. And what Paul Allen is doing there is admitting, actually, that he and Bill Gates copied a lot of stuff. And this is supposed to be a map of the internet. It's much more effective on a bigger screen. There are two names that are usually associated with the birth of the internet. One is a chap called Vint Cerf, who in 1985 was working for the Pentagon. And he came up with a design and a set of protocols that define how we send traffic around the internet. And he deliberately made those open. So he didn't put any patents on those or copyright on those. The whole idea was that anyone that wanted to apply those protocols could, because he knew that that platform would become more widely used. The second name that's associated with the internet as we know it today is a chap called Tim Berners-Lee, who in 1991 came up with the HTTP protocol, which you see whenever you type a URL into your address, and that made it useful to all of us. And again, those protocols were absolutely open, and he and Vint Cerf were convinced that the only way for this technology to be successful was for everyone to be able to build on it with the confidence that no one would come to them and say, "Oh, by the way, we own that bit, and you can't do that, or you're not allowed to do this, or you have to pay us some money to do that." But the third person that is not generally acknowledged in this field is a software developer called Richard Stallman. And interestingly enough, in 1985, he was a student at, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, who was very frustrated that he couldn't fix his printer driver. He couldn't get it to work. He was a very, top software developer, and he didn't have access to the code to fix his printer driver, and he thought this was madness. So he came up with something that he humorously called the GNU Manifesto, and that described the freedoms that he thought should be applied to software development, which were very similar to the openness and freedoms that the fathers of the internet described. And so what happened was that Richard Stallman and a lot of his colleagues started developing the software that would drive the internet. So we had this platform that was designed to be open, driven by software that itself was open and free. And so the mushrooming, the fantastic expansion of the internet and huge scalability that we've seen over the last 20 years has been driven by the fact that these two sides of the coin were free and could scale in such an amazing way. And so even when you see very expensive, what they call telco-grade equipment released by big companies such as Cisco and so on, at the heart of those routers and servers and so on is usually an open source operating system called Linux or something called BSD. And most of our websites are driven by web servers, and the technology that underpins those is something called Apache. So pretty much every page that's served up is touched by open source software. In New Zealand, if you have a .nz domain name, if you have, let's say, microsoft.co.nz, you're actually using open source software because the registry system that manages domain names in New Zealand is open source. And in fact, you can copy it and set up your own registry system and change it if you like. So you could have a Wanganui registration system. So open source software over the years has become very accepted. It's now gone from beyond driving infrastructure very much into your desktops, your homes. There isn't really a large Silicon Valley successful success story that isn't underpinned by that technology. So the next phase of my talk is really to cover off a little bit about Catalyst, the company that I helped found and still help run. So today, we tell the world that we're all about free and open source software, and that's quite a differentiator for us and something that we celebrate. But when we started in 1997, that wasn't at our forefront of our thinking at all. The internet was, however, and given that we're at a conference that is quite keen on pushing the idea of UFB, I think it's fair to say that fibre optic was also quite stimulating to this new little business that was set up, because Wellington was one of the first cities in the world to run a fibre loop around the city, and they just completed that in 1997, which happened to be the year we set up our company. And we didn't pay ourselves for 3 months because we paid CityLink to put a fibre connection up into the building we were in at the time. And that meant, with the aid of a good fan, a server rack, and a drip tray to stop the air conditioning unit dripping onto our computers, we were actually able to offer the same levels of service to our clients as Telecom and Datacom and Telstra. It was quite interesting. They had these, high-grade server rooms, but in terms of what the client saw, which was how fast can people get to our systems, we were able to offer that service to them. So that is a real demonstration of how good internet connectivity can stimulate small business. But what we found really hard, we were a bunch of technologists that set up the company, and what we found really hard was the whole idea that to get an internet project off the ground, we had to buy components and then convince a client to use those components. And usually the client would think, oh, well, this newfangled internet thing, I don't believe it's going to come to very much. That certainly was Bill Gates' idea in '94 of you. And so they would say, well, I tell you what, if you can replace or demonstrate that our customer system can work on the internet, we'll give you $30,000 to do that, which sounds a lot until you've spent it all on software licenses and hardware, and then you're trying to replicate a complicated business system with an internet front end. And so we very quickly decided that not only was that an unprofitable way of doing business, it was also, as technologists, it was quite frustrating, because our whole life's experience had been taking somebody's tools, somebody like Oracle or Microsoft, telling the clients this is what they could do, and then discovering that actually what that third party had told us they could do wasn't quite true. And we'd be carrying the can, but we couldn't, like Richard Stallman, we couldn't fix that printer driver, we couldn't fix what the problem was. So we very quickly started moving to use open source tools to develop systems for our clients. And those tools were Linux for our servers. We had open source databases, open source programming languages, and so on. And we very quickly gained a reputation for technical competence, which wasn't magic. It wasn't because we were better than the people down the road. It was just that we were able to get technology to do things at a reasonable price that we said that it should be able to do. So that was the ancient history. Sorry. So if you move forward to now, instead of building things from scratch for our clients, whether they're sort of Telecom or Fairfax or the education, there's a whole raft of tools now that pretty much cover every line of business that you could think about, whether it's word processing, a learning management system that a lot of schools and universities in New Zealand use. Certainly all the polytechnics use a system called Moodle, and that's a system that I was talking about that that the Middle Eastern government that we're working for is using. And just to explain that model, in about 2004, the Tertiary Education Commission had a look at how the polytechnic sector was delivering online learning and what the opportunities was. But they didn't want each polytechnic to go out and spend a lot of money and each come back with their own solution. They wanted them to collaborate. And we persuaded them that the best way to encourage collaboration was to use this sort of open source ethos of sharing and to also base their solution on an open source product, and that one being Moodle. Now the money that they spent on Moodle allowed it to serve something like 40,000 students. Moodle up until then hadn't really been in big sites, although it was a very popular open source platform. It hadn't been there. Our next client for Moodle was actually the Open University in the United Kingdom, which has 200,000 students. So the Tertiary Education Commission put a little bit of money into getting Moodle to the next step. The next users put a lot of money into getting Moodle to do a whole lot of other things, which all the polytechnics in New Zealand benefited from. And these are just some of the clients of Catalyst that use open source technology. So we might not all be gamblers, but the TAB uses an open source platform to run its online betting site. And when the Melbourne Cup is on, that site goes absolutely ballistic. We talk about TradeMe being a popular site, but the peaks and troughs that you get with the TAB sites are quite phenomenal. Telecom, we use it for. And we have customers like Intel and so on overseas. I'd say probably about 20 to 25% of our revenues come from overseas. And as I said before, if you're a startup company or a local council or a government agency, you should absolutely be following the example that's being set in Silicon Valley, which is, let's not spend any money where we don't have to. Let's start using these tools that everyone else is using, and let's build our business around these tools. So Google's search engine, Google's thousands and hundreds of thousands of servers are all running open source software. They're all running Linux. They use Python to develop all their applications and so on. And it often does my head in to see small enterprises in New Zealand trying to get their head above the water, spending money needlessly, but also missing out on some of those international contacts that they could have if they were actually using some of these open source products and talking to other communities around the world who are also using them. So we're missing out in two ways. One is financially, and the other is in community building and potentially building up clients. So just briefly getting on to some of the issues that I see with the opposite of the sort of free and open source software. The opposite of free and open source software would be proprietary licenses. This is where you'll buy an item like an iPad or an iPhone or Microsoft Office or whatever, and you'll get a license which tells you what you can't do. And in the case of something like an iPad, it'll be packed full of what some people have started calling anti-features. Features that as a consumer you don't want. I mean, why should you need to be constantly hooking your iPad up to iTunes to let you do whatever it is Apple does or doesn't want you to do? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, in fact, that programmers have to spend time programming those annoying anti-consumer features into their devices when they could be spending time making them even better. And what concerns me is not that these devices aren't beautiful technology. They are. It's that they're turning us into consumers. They're changing us from being the people that are building robots out there. And did you notice the most crowded stands in the hall over there, the ones where they've got robots spinning around outside? They're changing us from being people that can tinker and fiddle and make things and invent things to people that consume. This here is a computer that costs, how much longer have I got? No. Okay. £25 or $30 US maybe. It's a Raspberry Pi. It's not too dissimilar in power to the iPad. The hardware is open hardware, and you don't have to have it in a Perspex case that it's in. It'll plug into any monitor, whether it's high definition or your old CRT TV screen. It'll plug into the internet. You can plug in, the SD hard drive cards, and you can run a desktop on there that will let you do, your word processing, browse the internet, the sort of things that you would do at school anyway, many of the sort of things. But I would say that if you gave every student one of those, you would encourage them to look at these things and start tinkering. You're opening up the platform and you're saying to people, start playing. Now, it might be that 99% of students won't. They'll just keep typing in their documents as they will. But it just needs one student to say, oh, actually, if I put 10 of these together and I did this and I did that, I could have 20 robots attacking the teacher. And it's that sort of mentality that I think we need to be encouraging more at schools. In fact, I'm kind of afraid that we need to have more of a hacker culture at schools, which means a culture where we're playing. It's a number 8 wire culture that some people are embarrassed talking about in New Zealand, but that's what gives us an advantage. And when you talk to the founders of Weta Workshops, Richard Taylor and his mates, they talk about trying to recruit people from rural New Zealand because they're so much better at being creative than people that have just been delivered and who have been turned into consumers, as we tend to do in our larger cities and so on. So the Raspberry Pi might not be the answer for education, but it's certainly, I think, part of the answer. And again, has anyone seen this film The Guard? It's an Irish film. Okay, well, if you get the chance, go and see it. In this film, there's a FBI agent goes to Ireland, and he's trying to track down some cocaine smugglers with the help of the local Irish Garda. And at one stage, he's talking to the Irish police, and he says, there's $500 million worth of cocaine being shipped into the country. And somebody grabs the mic, leans over and says, that's $500 million, lads. That's a lot of money. $500 million is a lot of money. The Auckland City Council is spending $500 million with Deloitte right now building a new asset management system. Well, they're not building a new one. If they were, that might be different. Sorry, buying a new asset management system from an organization called SAP. That really, really upsets me. Most of that money is going overseas. Nobody there is thinking about, could that money have been used to enhance an existing system, to build a new system, to generate a company like Orion Health or Jade Software or whatever, an exporting company from New Zealand? Nobody seemed to think that. That's $500 million. It gets worse though, because the IRD has announced it's going to spend $1.5 billion. That's $1.5 billion, lads. Sorry, just got to wake you up. Revamping its IT. And most of that money is going to a French company called Capgemini. In the 1980s, when the IRD first developed its current taxation system, they spent their money locally, and out of that came one of New Zealand's most successful software companies, which is now called Jade Software, and you'll remember it used to sponsor Jade Stadium in Christchurch. But nobody's thinking like that anymore. $1.5 billion going overseas with nobody thinking what that means, what that could be done for the local economy. If I were a technologist in New Zealand, I would be thinking about my future, and I would be thinking, I'll follow that money. I'll go to where the destination of that money is, because that's where the exciting work is happening. So it shouldn't be like that. And just to finish off with another positive story about open source software. This was, I don't know if I can actually. This was an email we received after the second Christchurch earthquake about a member of staff that was down there. Christchurch just had an earthquake, no power, Dan and his family are all good. Within 2 or 3 hours of that news coming out, a group of open source technical collaborators had got together and set up what became known as the Christchurch Recovery Map. They used a piece of software called Ushahidi, which has been used for monitoring elections and disaster relief type work all around the world. And what they allowed people to do was to identify what was happening where in the city, and in particular, what facilities were available to people in the days and weeks following the earthquake. So, you know, what roads were open, where there were toilets, where there was water, where there were ATMs, where the chemists were. Not only was it a technical collaboration, but volunteers from around the world were attracted to that platform. And so there was a 24-hour cycle of analysing messages and information that was coming in through social media like Twitter. If there was a #EQNZ tag that was taken in and analysed and put on the map if it was valid, text messages, Facebook and so on. That just took 2 or 3 hours to get set up, and then the volunteers that flowed from that, it took just a few days to get going. The alternative is the equivalent of what happened when motor cars were first invented, where legislation was passed to slow down these dangerous beasts, so that if you had a motor car, you had to have a man walking in front of it, waving a red flag to warn people about this oncoming hazard. The fact is that legislation was pushed by the owners of the horse and carriage industry, who felt very threatened by it. And I'd say we're in a similar situation. There's a existing industry that is very threatened by the disruption of free and open source software. And they will do their damnedest. They might not be able to get legislation through, although they might do through trade agreements. They'll do their damnedest to stop you using this software and persuade you that it's not the right thing to do. And I would say, don't slow yourselves down. Give yourselves the opportunity that the software can bring you. Make sure your local government is doing the same as well, and not sending your tax dollars overseas, but keeping them here for your benefit, and release your potential. Thank you.